Arthur. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lev Gantley, and I'm a supervising associate at Simmons & Simmons. My colleague Ben and I will shortly be moderating the panel as Arthur just. Thanks very much, Tony. So as Tony's talked about adaptation techniques in relation to climate change in the mining sector, what we'll aim to do is talk about some of the things that the mining industry can do to combat against the worst possible consequences of climate change. So with that, I'll just introduce between myself and Ben, we'll just introduce the panel very briefly. So in person, we have Rob Simmons, who works in investor relations and corporate development at Ferrexpo as head of corporate development. And Rob's previous role is being the head of business development and investor relations at Avocet Mining. And we also have Roberto Gonzalez, who is a principal within the Green Economy Climate Action Group at the European Bank for Infrastructure Development. And Roberto is an engineer by training and has spent the last 15 years applying his technical skills towards modeling, optimization, and evaluation of large projects. He has extensive hands-on experience with the technical, regulatory, market, and external factors that impact the long-term viability of multi-million investments in the natural resources industry. And at the far end, we've got my colleague Ben.
Hi all, thanks Levin, and great to be co-moderating this session. And participating online, we also have Daria Grigorova, who is the Director of Sustainable Development at Polyus, the largest gold producer in Russia and a top 5 global gold major. Daria is responsible for driving sustainability progress at the company through setting progressive goals, launching sustainability projects, and managing ESG sustainability reporting and disclosure. We also have Elena Haken, who is the co-founder and CEO of Climate Governance Initiative Russia. She is a partner of Digital Horizon Investment Group, and she is also independent director of Inter-RAO, an active speaker and participant in discussions on the development of current investment and private capital management strategies in Russia. And then last but not least, we have Vladimir Zalushky, who is head of communications and investor relations at Severstal. Prior to his work at Severstal, Vladimir's roles included working as an investor and public relations director at Mint Capital, a Scandinavian private equity fund in Moscow, and as deputy head of communications department at Michel, a New York Stock Exchange listed Russian mining company. So it's great to have everyone here. And Lev, do you want to kick us off with the first question?
Thanks, Ben. So I think we've heard quite a bit on this topic already today, but I think it would be good to get a take maybe from each of you in terms of how, in your view, climate change is actually affecting the mining industry. Just maybe a 30-second snapshot, maybe starting with Elena, if that's okay.
Yes, absolutely. Hello, everyone. And well, what I can say, the transition from the Russian industry standpoint, I can say that the transition from words to actions remains a slow one. And I can say it's both in Russia and in the world at large. One of the reasons for this is a continued lack of collaboration across industries and borders. Companies struggle to justify expensive changes to operating models to investors without the certainty that their peers are actually implementing the same changes. Each company, I think, knows exactly how to calculate each ton of carbon emissions with the footprint of their products. However, at the same time, we know, for example, that in China, they would still continue increasing their level of greenhouse emissions until 2030. Apparently, we have to think locally, but obviously within the international trade, we need international coordination and agreements, because 50%, if not more, of our products go to international markets. Meaning that without proper regulations and support, it would be just unfair if certain companies invest in the development and in tackling of climate change issues without any real competitive advantage. Those are the main, takeaways we took from COP26. We were in Glasgow. There were a lot of discussions on this, and until we have this clear-cut understanding and regulation along the whole supply chain, it would be very difficult to move forward.
Thank you, Elena. If we could just go to Daria next, please.
Yes, hello to everybody. It's my pleasure to join. I would echo what Elena was saying. Of course, legislation is very important and it is not that well development. And while speaking about the targets, well, I can mention that Russia's aims to be carbon neutral by 2060. That was exactly announced by President Putin on COP26 that was mentioned. But the tools how to reach it and the laws, the legislation, how to go there is still under development. So as a mining company, we do follow international examples, recommendations and guidance that are already developed on climate and adaptation. And that's really what help us to go further and to do steps on climate change adaptation.
Thanks, Daria. And Vladimir, how about yourself?
Hello, everyone. Yes, happy to be part of MINEX. Thank you for raising this interesting topic. So I would agree with the speakers and can add my own comments. So just for a broader picture, production of steel certainly remains a CO2 and energy intensive activity. And according to some data, steel makers account for around 7% of the global emissions. However, as population increases, demand for steel will grow. The positive thing is that well-known steel is 100% recyclable without the loss of its properties. And secondly, it's made from iron ore, which is the second most widely found material on Earth. Our take on that. So we're in full support of the Paris Climate Agreement and of the other legislations. Things are really quickly changing here in Russia. And you saw the Russian delegation at COP26. They have been quite active participants in this very important process. We have two points to say. First of all, we do agree with Elena that so far exchange of best practice is quite limited, and we from our side try to push that as fast as possible. For instance, we are part of the global initiative from the World Steel Association. They have a program called Step Up. Highly recommend other steel makers to join. That's a global platform for sharing experience of decarbonization in steel. Secondly, we are from our side ourselves are offering our clients, partners, and all interested parties to sign our own client memorandum to exchange experience. And first signatories have been already Schneider Electric and Air Liquide, those well-known global companies. And there are more. We welcome everyone listening to me right now. If you want to share with Severstal your experience, to listen to our view, please let me know. And finally, I would like to say that we are a fully vertically integrated company. So it means that we also produce iron ore and coking coal and not only steel. That's why we bear responsibility for the whole chain, both in steel and mining. So I will be happy to share later some cases from our experience, if you like. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Vladimir. And how about Roberto?
Yeah, so hi, nice to see you all here. So I think that the climate change is changing the mining industry in three ways. First, there is the demand for minerals. That there is going to be a change in that. If you follow some of the estimates, like for instance, from the International Energy Agency, the demand for some of them will be multiplied by a big number. So lithium will be multiplied by 40 times, cobalt by 20, copper will double, and that is just because of the energy transition, of the change in how we are generating energy and the electrification of a lot of industries. Then we have the expectations of the investors and regulators. So low carbon products will have, or lower carbon products will have a premium compared to others. And that is, for instance, driven by big markets like the European Union and the Battery Alliance that you will, and the battery regulation. So you will need to have a low or a carbon footprint that is within the range to enter the market. And then you have adaptation, as Tony mentioned. I mean, climate change is here. So change in waterfalls and water stress and all of that is happening. So companies need to invest on that, adapt to that, and in order to manage the risk and avoid disruptions either in the supply chains or in the production that will at the end cost money for them.
Thanks, Roberto. And Rob?
Thank you very much. We're an iron ore pellet producer. I work in communications. So the thing that I'm seeing the most of with climate change is that climate change cuts through all stakeholder groups. So it doesn't matter if you're talking to a local community, employees, investors, lenders, equipment manufacturers, it's the same topic. And it doesn't matter if you're an iron ore pellet producer like we are, or a copper producer. I see the same topics being raised by different mining companies. I think the main thing that is most interesting for this particular point in time is that there's a lot of conversation around net zero, which is something that is the destination. Not a lot of conversation around the decarbonisation journey that we're all about to take on. And I think one of the most interesting comments that was mentioned just here was the word collaboration. So the decarbonisation is something we cannot do on our own. We have this wonderful thing called Scope 3, which in its very essence requires collaboration across the value chain, and also requires understanding of what you do and what your customer does and what your supplier does, and therefore brings everyone together for an era of collaboration in the mining industry.
Thanks, Rob. We'll hopefully have a bit of time to get to Scope 3 in a few minutes as well. So maybe just to go back to Roberto, and to dig a little bit deeper into emission sources, can you maybe summarize where the majority of emissions comes from in the mining sector, maybe particularly in light of the various sort of Scope 1, 2, and 3 profiles? It'd be good to get your take on that.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, regardless of where the emissions comes from in the mining sector, what we expect is that to achieve the Paris Agreement targets, they will need to halve before 2040. So that is a big change. And that accounts for Scope 1, 2, and 3. So the Scope 1 emissions are the ones that are generated in the facility, basically. The Scope 2 are related to the energy requirements of the facility, so imported power, imported steam, and then generated outside the facility. And the Scope 3, as mentioned by Rob, are linked to the value chain and is regarding feedstocks, products, equipment, everything. So is taken much more than the same company that we're talking about emissions. So in that regard, the carbonization, I mean, the first thing to start is the Scope 1 and 2 emissions, because it's the easiest one, it's the low-hanging fruit that you have. And those in the mining industry are linked to the power, to the fuel consumption, and to the chemical reactions that you have for processing the ore. So in the chemical reactions, you cannot do much because it's the nature of your ore, it's the nature of your product. So you can have carbon capture and storage, but that is limited by where you are and the possibility to store that CO2. Then you have the electricity and the fuel. So those you can optimize them. You can, and that is something that is an important message also. So you have decarbonization by decreasing your electricity consumption and your fuel consumption, but you also have economic benefits. You will produce more ore at a lower OPEX, or you will have a lower need for natural gas, for instance, which is quite good right now. So then the electricity, once you have explored everything that you can do to optimize and to decrease that, then you need to go into how to decarbonize the source of your carbon in Scope 1 and 2. So it's the electricity. So can you just have hydropower, because that is the best one that you can have, because it's reliable, it's cheap, and it's low carbon. Or maybe you will not have access to that, so then go to renewable power, like under a power purchase agreement, a PPA. That is not available in all the countries and needs to be certified. And then you can install solar panels, turbines in your site. That is something that we are seeing, but that you need a backup plan, because obviously it will not work 24 hours all the year. And then we have fuel. So fuel can be replaced in some things by electricity, and that will drive emissions lower. Like you can have electrical heaters that are better and better now, and you can have higher capacities and higher temperatures with them. You can go for replacing the trucks by electric trucks. That is starting. It's not there. You need to ensure how to replace the batteries and how to maximize the working time of those trucks, because batteries charging takes a long time. Then you have hydrogen, that is a big promising one. Hydrogen needs to be green, so it needs to be green hydrogen from electrolyzers or low carbon hydrogen. And that is an interesting option for trucking. There are several companies trying and doing trials with hydrogen trucks. The advantage is fast time to refuel. The disadvantage is, well, hydrogen, the logistics, the high pressures, the security, the safety of dealing with it. Hydrogen can also be used in some of the process for reducing ores, and that reduce the carbon footprint. And then another thing that we can do for fuels is biofuels, biomass. That is something that is doable. The issue with biofuels is that we will enter in a big competition with road transport, shipping, aviation, and they need to be sustainable. So you need to ensure that.
Just check one thing, just on hydrogen, do you mean that in the context of scope 1 mitigation?
Yes, because you can use hydrogen to replace the diesel that you are using in your trucks, in your mine, and that will be net zero.
One more quick point, just to double check, corporate PPAs in particular, that's in relation to scope 2 emissions.
Yes, correct.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Roberto. That's a really good overview. So given all of those challenges and I guess opportunities that you've described, Roberto, and in the context of being in a world where there are net zero targets everywhere, I'd sort of like to explore a little bit what emissions reductions the mining industry can or should be setting itself. So, Daria, turning to you, how do you think targets should be framed in the mining industry? Do you think we should be talking about net zero mining now, or do you think targets should be more specific than that? Do you think we should be commodity specific or geographically specific, or how do you see that?
Yeah, I would agree that many of our mining peers have publicly declared their intention to become carbon neutral by 2050. While their, so to say, long-term vision or destination is clear, the greater challenge lies exactly in the immediate future. So we see already that many companies are struggling to understand the material impacts that their goals are going to have on valuations, operations, employees, and markets over the next few years. So to meet their 2050 carbon neutrality targets, they need to invest in transition strategies today and start to implement initiatives, meaning having some specific targets. So I would say that metals and mining industry is diverse, so it is while it would be unreasonable to expect the same KPIs from all players without properly accounting for their starting points and profiles, company profiles. Like different metals have a different carbon footprints. For example, gold mining is among the lowest carbon intensive metals per unit value. Like, for example, some Russian majors, they produce 20-40 million tons CO2 per year every year, while others like us and Polis, for example, have CO2 emissions as low as 1.5 million tons. So we are different in that sense. The targets should be different, diverse. And many companies have already successfully reducing their carbon footprint by switching to renewables, scope 2, what Rob was mentioned, and reducing diesel and coal usage, that's scope 1. Not very obvious with scope 3. It looks like we need to have some common approach in mining towards our suppliers and contractors, for example, mining equipment producers. That was a point of discussion today, but that really needs some common approach in mining. And speaking about the targets, I have already mentioned that Russia's aim to be carbon neutral by 2060. Speaking about the industry, you know that before COP26, ICMM published an open letter on climate change adaptation, and Polis is a member of that association, International Council on Mining and Metals, and I do highly recommend other mining company to come in. And so Polis have also joined ICMM members in committing to achieving a goal of net zero scope 1, 2 emissions by 2050, but also setting exact targets for near and mid-term reduction by 2023. And I think that is important. So to sum up what I'm trying to say, yes, it's important not only to have 2050 targets, but to have specific near and mid-term targets following companies' starting point, scopes 1 to 3 estimations, assessments, climate risk assessments of sites, meaning having geographically specific targets. And I would agree with what was Tony speaking in the beginning about importance of climate physical risk estimation. And that's what we are doing at Polis. So we already are reducing scope 1 with coal usage reduction, Scope 2 having 100% of renewables usage. And at the moment, Sustainable Development Department is leading the process of climate strategy development in the company, including specific targets, what I consider to be crucial for company, and more than that, to site level, to be specific as much as possible.
Thanks, Dora. And let's go to Rob. So, Rob, you, what are your views on targets? You talked a little bit in your intro about the journey that we're all on, and so I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about that. And I guess, how also do you think the sector should communicate that kind of apparent tension you've got between being carbon intensive on one hand, but then the things that you're providing, the resources, are precisely the things you need for that carbon journey?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I think that with target setting, it's really useful to look at things in terms of different phases of reporting. So 5 years ago, you had the leaders in this space producing ESG reports, potentially targets that suited them and suited their narrative, and was very much used as a marketing tool. As the space has developed, you've got frameworks that have come into place. You've got legislation like TCFD that we heard about earlier, which has forced the hand of some companies to publish data that they otherwise wouldn't have published, but also is really important because it starts to standardize things. So investors, stakeholders, lenders can look at things on an equal footing. Doesn't matter if you're an iron ore producer, doesn't matter if you're a copper producer. With that, I think we had an initial phase of generic target setting, very much off the shelf. It's easy to align yourself with the sovereign decarbonisation target, because if you're operating in a country that's going to be carbon free by 2050, how else are you going to operate if you're going to continue producing carbon? So I think it's important to have a medium-term target to give an idea of the trajectory, whether that's a 10% reduction in the next 10 years or a 30% or more. And I think we very much finished that phase. We're now in a phase where the investors and stakeholders are asking, okay, so how are you going to do this? We saw recently with an AGM of a large diversified miner, they announced some targets which didn't have science-based backing, and the proxy agencies very rightly raised the point that, how are you actually going to achieve this? We're now starting to see information dripped into the market of the journey is now going to cost this, and if you want to back us then to achieve these targets, then it's going to cost money. I think that's where we're at, that point of realization where the end goal is very known, very much talked about, but it's the journey that people are adapting to understand. In terms of sector-specific targets, we in the steel value chain, I think it's important to understand where each component of that value chain sits. So we are an iron ore pellet producer. Our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions are higher because we process a material that is lower in iron content, but we produce a product that is higher in iron content than the rest. That product then goes into the steel mill and has a lower carbon footprint. So on a scope 1, 2, and 3 basis, we are actually lower in terms of our carbon footprint. But you require a degree of understanding in sort of the wider community as to that point. So I think you can set targets based on a sector if it's on a scope 1, 2, and 3 basis. I think what's really interesting actually also coming around in terms of geographies, we're seeing with the EU, the carbon border adjustment mechanism is almost creating its own ecosystem for decarbonisation in isolation, and they're very much putting up barriers for material coming in, and that's a particularly interesting piece. So I think for me, targets should be focused on sectors, so treat aluminium differently to iron ore. And I think regionally, we're going to get little pockets of decarbonisation goals that are different.
That's interesting. And so, Roberta, Rob talked there a little bit about that dynamic where companies will set an agenda and effectively stakeholders are policing that agenda. So how important do you think it is, and how much pressure is there, particularly in the post-COP26 world, for the mining sector to show real ambition in decarbonisation targets, both from a reputational perspective, but also from that shareholder expectation perspective. And I guess it'd be interesting to hear whether that push is really a push to be more ambitious in the targets, or whether that push is to be more to show more of how those targets are being achieved.
Yeah, so I mean, so far, mining sector has somewhat escaped the COP. So it's like hasn't been like target, but the stakeholders in the mining and the CEOs and the major companies needs to come together and align to the Paris Agreement and decarbonize. And basically, what you need to be Paris aligned is to decarbonize quickly. So it's not a matter of the 250 target, because as we see in the co-op with the NDCs that we have, we are not getting to the targets that of 2 degrees. So there needs to be more ambition for that. And then there is the banks and investors. They are looking at the carbon footprint of their investments. And there is a much more aggressive kind of shareholder involvement in companies, as we have seen with the oil majors, that will come to the mining industry and will help to move things further and faster. So I think that one of the biggest things that there is in terms of investors and for the mining companies is that they need to have I mean, ambitious or not, a clear low carbon pathway, a clear low carbon decarbonization strategy, and climate corporate governance. We were talking about governance. Governance is very important, just to be sure that there is no greenwashing, as we talked at the beginning. So all these we're getting frameworks like the TCFD and things like that are helping to make things better. But if you don't have that, your financing options will become more and more limited. On the opposite, if you have that, you will have access to ESG bonds, to green bonds, or concessional financing. For instance, the EBRD have a high impact program that is concessional financing with the Green Climate Fund. And that is applies to the mining sector. And we have 2 things. So we have concessional financing and technical assistance support. So in the concessional financing, basically, once we are financing a project, we will have a set of targets. And when those targets are achieved, the interest of the loan basically will go down until a floor that we have. And then we have the assistance, the technical support. And the technical support is to help companies to develop a low carbon trajectory. So basically, I mean, decarbonizing an entire sector has never been done. And there is a lot of risk on doing that for companies, governments, investors, and everything. So there needs to be a plan. There needs to be some thinking behind that, and that is clear in order to take the right steps, the right technological choices in order to minimize those risks and allow the capital to go to the right projects.
Do you factor in some of the sort of scope 3 mitigations into the sort of pricing and the interest step downs into some of your facility agreements?
Yeah, so normally not. So we're focusing a lot in scope 1 and 2 because they are under control of the company that we're investing on. But under the European Raw Materials and the Battery Alliance, those scope 3 emissions will come in, and that will affect your market.
I'm just asking because I think the question that I had in mind is just for raw, in terms of and maybe this is a bit broad, but just in terms of scope 1, 2, and 3, and how mining companies can reach the targets they set for themselves. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what your thoughts on that are, and specifically, if you want to focus on scope 3, you can, but also you talk about scope 1 and 2. If there are things to add there that haven't been already spoken about.
Okay. I mean, I talk about scope 3 because it's 90% of our carbon footprint. So it's the aspect of our business by its very definition that we do not control, but it is by far the biggest component, and therefore it has the lowest hanging fruit for addressing that particular piece. Decarbonisation is a relatively simple problem. It's just the timescale in which you can achieve it and the cost of achieving that. So for Expo, Scope 1 and Scope 2 are three things. It's diesel in the trucks and the mining fleet. It's electricity in the processing plant, and something fairly specific to Ferrexpo, we use natural gas in our pelletizers. So the majority of mining companies will be diesel, electricity. And how do you source energy from those two components in a green manner? And obviously we can talk about green hydrogen, we can talk about battery technologies, we can talk about ammonium in trucks. These are all technologies that will be adapted and become available over time. There's a lot of talk about green hydrogen at the moment. We would love to adopt this at our sites, but it's not commercially viable today. Will it be commercially viable in 10 years' time? Probably. So it's something that the mining companies can evolve and adapt over time with, and take on these new technologies as they become available. So it's a slow journey, and it will be primarily led by the equipment manufacturers, but obviously they are led by their own stakeholders. In terms of Scope 3, to talk specifically about Ferrexpo, so we produce an iron ore pellet. We produce two types of pellet. One is for the blast furnace, which is a form of making steel with coal. And we also produce the direct reduction pellet, which is uses either natural gas or electricity to produce steel. So many people in the room will have heard of the Green Steel initiative up in Sweden, Hybrid, and they produced green steel this summer using iron ore pellets, the DR pellets. So for us, it's I've not heard of another case in the metals and mining space that Ferrexpo actually controls its own Scope 3 predominantly. 90% of our Scope 3 is the steelmaking component. And for us, it's a case of producing more DR pellets. So as the more DR pellet we produce, the lower our Scope 3 becomes. But obviously, that's not something that is applicable to most mining companies. So again, it is sector specific and it's company specific. So I can only really talk about Ferrexpo, unfortunately.
Well, thanks, Rob. I think if we can go to Vladimir next and go back to Scope 1, that would be helpful. So, Vladimir, just in relation to replacing some of the Scope 1 emissions at mine sites with, for example, solar facilities and storage, how economically and practically viable are those types of avenues that companies could potentially go down?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, let me briefly comment on the target setting, because that was quite a hot topic, first of all, and secondly, was just recently discussed. So as investor relations with C4 and the management, we hold up to, I guess, 200 meetings a year with investors from around the world. And the evident question is, do you have a target in CO2 emissions? But the more frequent question we are hearing, I guess every company in the world today, is what sort of projects do you have? How will you achieve this target, right? So our take on that is that companies should set very ambitious internal targets, raise them all the time, but announce publicly only realistic targets. I can share you our experience. Just 2 years ago, when we started setting public targets, we announced a short-term target of just 3% to reduce CO2 emissions by 2023. But the following year, this year, we announced already 10% reduction target until 2030. And we plan to revise this target every year as long as our understanding and technologies develop, right? So we track global best practice. I mentioned we want to embrace a lot of companies around ourselves and consultants. So I think this is very important, because this is the only way to create trust and to meet the targets. On your question, so as a steel and mining company, let's split it in two. I will be very short in my cases explaining. So in steel, the biggest CO2 emitters are energy generation, coke, and sinter production. So captive generation of electricity is one of the solutions, really. As in this case, for instance, our company, we can use and already use gases from our blast furnaces. Secondly, what we're thinking about right now is we can buy green energy on the market. It's either hydro or nuclear or any other alternative, wind, for instance, if it's available. So as for coke batteries, the solution is already in place, and it's use higher quality coke and coal. And we set all the time ambitious targets for our own divisions, and very demanding on the quality of coal we buy on the market. It allows to produce more byproducts, useful byproducts, and consume less energy. So finally, with mining, we in steel, we constantly experiment with replacing coke with natural gas, and our long-term target is to finally reduce the use of coal to the extent possible, to replace it with iron ore and value-added iron ore products, which were partly mentioned by my colleague on the panel from the iron ore company. So that's, I guess, is the long-term trend for a steel company to be very much integrated with iron ore products. In mining, so scope 1 emissions mostly come from either mobile sources, it's auto, actually trucks, and stable sources, it's power generation. What was already mentioned, so with the stable sources, so carbon capture storage can be really deployed at mines. Secondly, it can be replacement of oil and coal with natural gas at existing power stations. And finally, if the location is too remote and climate permits, companies can use wind or solar power stations like our company, sister company Nordgold, which is a gold miner in Africa mostly represented. So they use solar power stations. They can hardly be used here in the north of Russia, probably. I'm not an expert in that regard, but in Africa, they are widely used, and that's definitely a way. Finally, coal mines operations have side effect is methane gas. And at the same time, that can be useful byproduct. So we use it at our Vorkuta plant, mining plant. It's in the north of Russia. We use it for energy generation. And at another plant, which makes iron ore in Karelia, Russian Karelia next to Finland. So they use at their heaters processed wood as biofuel. So, I mean, that can also be an option. As for mobile sources of CO2 emissions, it's trucks at open pits. What was already mentioned, the first step is to replace them with gas-driven. To what extent can they really be electric at that stage? It's a big question mark, but hopefully the global automakers will finally develop those and we can all use them.
Okay. Thanks, Vladimir. Maybe we just go to Yelena next, please. Yelena, what about something like the Climate Smart Mining Initiative? Is this a multifaceted approach to decarbonizing the mining sector? Or do you think it's a viable option, or what are your thoughts on that generally?
Yes, absolutely. Before I get to this question, I would like to comment on what Vladimir was just saying. Just a little comment. I must say that physically and economically conditions, especially in Russia, given its geographical place, do not always allow this reduction to be done. So physically, it's just not possible. For example, we have a surplus of electricity from renewable energy sources in the southern regions of Russia. But in order to deliver it to other regions, the construction of infrastructure is required, and the cost of such reconstruction will be more expensive than actually generating this electricity. And this is a huge challenge. And actually for us in Russia, one of the highest risks of renewable energy, of the use of renewable energy, if we especially talk about solar or wind power, is the unevenness of energy production. And as a consequence, the impossibility of planning, the production cycle, which actually puts companies at large risks. So basically, in some cases, it's probably easier for companies to buy carbon credits than to replace traditional sources with renewable energy sources. Unfortunately, we don't have a straightforward answer to this challenge, but it's apparently a work in progress. But that's a challenge we're trying to tackle, and it's not that, straightforward. Unfortunately, given the geographical hurdles, it's not just always possible. with regards to your question, like climate smart mining challenge, well, I would like to remind that with the climate smart mining, World Banking is targeting a total investment of 50 million to be deployed over a 5-year time frame. Well, the main question is whether this money will be enough and how it will be distributed between countries and companies. And will it not happen that the extraction of some minerals will be replaced by others, and the issues of environmental pollution and impact on the climate will not be fully resolved? On one hand, we are speaking about trillions of euro amounts. On the other hand, this is only 50 million US dollars. So on one hand, this is, I mean, apparently we like the fact that this challenge exists, but on the other hand, it's not that clear cut. So basically, the facility evolved out of the World Bank report, The Growing Role of Minerals and Metals for a Low Carbon Future. And they found out that a low carbon future will be significantly more mineral intensive than, so to say, business as usual scenario. And I mean, the numbers are just gigantic. So they said that global demand for strategic minerals like lithium, graphite, nickel will skyrocket by 900%, 300%. So like huge numbers. But the thing is that we do not have like real visibility what will exactly happen with the money actually invested. And you know, mining giants like Rio Tinto or Anglo American, they all supported the initiative, and they all said, well, apparently we will invest, but the amount of the investment from our perspective is minimal. It's like $1 million US. It's better than nothing, but seems like, you know, a nominal participation. And they said, when commenting on this, they said, well, we want to be seen as part of the solution rather than a problem. So we decided to support, but how far would this go? It's very hard to say.
Thanks very much, Elena. I think with that, we might just need to conclude the panel session, because I think we're starting to, excuse the pun, eat into everyone's lunch hour. But I think we've just got one quick video.